On an unusually warm January day in 2021, a team from Hunter Research arrived at the Friends Cemetery in Randolph, New Jersey to conduct an archaeological investigation. The investigation is part of a major restoration program begun in 2018 by the Friends Meeting House and Cemetery Association, which owns and maintains the 1758 Randolph Friends Meeting House and Cemetery. As part of the restoration program, the association is planning to improve the paths leading to the meeting house and add environmentally friendly parking in the northwest corner of the cemetery. Any excavation on the meeting house site must be preceded by an archaeological investigation to assure that historically sensitive materials, such as burials, will not be disturbed. The Hunter team was asked to assess the burials in the cemetery to determine if the paths and parking project posed any risks, either to the burials or to those who might be walking or parking over burials. In this video, lead archaeologist Jim Lee describes how the Hunter team conducted their investigation and then summarizes their findings.
Thanks for inviting me to talk. We really enjoyed this work and I'm glad to be able to talk about it. By way of introduction, my name's Jim Lee. I'm the principal archaeologist with Hunter Research, which is a private cultural resource consulting firm based out of Trenton, New Jersey. Been around for over 35 years. Been with the company for about 20. The primary goals of the investigation were to determine the presence or absence of graves and presence or absence of human remains within those graves. So there's a little bit of a difference between grave shafts and burials, because burials indicate there's some human remains in there. There can be grave shafts that have had the human remains disinterred. So we want to determine the presence of these grave shafts. We want to map them accurately. And then we wanted to partially excavate and sample the graves to determine whether human remains were present. We specifically said at the very beginning that we were not going to remove any human remains from the site. What we did is dig down, expose, document, and respectfully rebury the remains. So, and we didn't remove any human remains from the site. We also wanted to determine, importantly, the depths of those remains below the ground surface. That would help in planning the potential parking surface. And there was a couple other little questions about some of the things that were found on the radar survey that we looked into. All this stuff was put together and written up in an archaeological work plan that was submitted to the county and to the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office for review. So this was reviewed, our work plan was reviewed by an archaeologist before we did any of the work. We also always do our own bit of background research before we start any project. And this is just a sample of some of the things we do. We go and review secondary sources. We review historic maps and photos, aerial photos when you can get them, and just try to sort of build up all the information we can about a project. We're lucky in this case because the Friends group has done such a great job of doing the research already and making that research available online. This table is I think, as Nick mentioned earlier, these are the documented burials that aren't represented by stones in the graveyard, which there's, I think, 50 of in total. And this is of course not uncommon for Quaker burial sites. One of the other bits of research we did is we looked at other instances of people excavating Quaker cemeteries. There's not a lot of American Quaker cemeteries that have been excavated. There's one in Alexandria, Virginia that was excavated and well documented. Most of the ones we looked at were actually in England, where they've excavated several 18th and 19th century Quaker cemeteries and importantly, done good publications about the excavations. These are just some of the basics about the Quaker cemetery and burial practices, and I'll go through these relatively quickly. Early Quaker burial alignments and orientations did not necessarily follow an ordained pattern. Often individuals were buried in the order in which they died, and the next available plot was used with no consideration for familial relationships. They also allowed the burial of non-members within their burial grounds. At the beginning, the use of grave markers was discouraged, particularly those with any epitaphs or decorations. But by the mid-19th century, possibly because burial grounds were filling up and they needed to know where older burials were so they knew where to put the new burials, the Book of Discipline was revised to allow the use of simple uniform grave markers at the discretion of the meeting. Later on, some families would add substantial monuments that don't necessarily adhere to any of the other policies. So I think there's probably some grave markers in this burial ground that were added later that weren't part of the Quaker use of the burial ground. Now, the actual burials themselves, Quakers were not generally buried with grave goods, although simple clothing items have been observed at other burial grounds. But not normally no jewelry, things like that even. Simple wood coffins were preferred, either locally made or ready-made. And some coffin hardware and decoration may be present on some of these coffins, because sometimes getting one that was pre-made was actually less expensive than having one custom made. Although there are cases where expensive coffins, pretty fancy, well, not fancy, expensive coffins were used, but made of simple traditional materials and design. And this is all has to do with the Quaker belief system, where it was inappropriate to elevate some individuals over others in an effort to refrain from ostentatious displays of wealth or status. Friends practiced plainness, a doctrine of simplicity that Quakers adopted into every element of their lives, from manner of dress to funeral behavior. So you have to kind of keep that in mind when we're looking at the burials that we identified. Okay, these are just a couple more shots of the radar survey going on, and Dr. Tim Horsley, we feel is one of the best around right now, especially when it comes to burial grounds. We always try to use him. He really, really looks at his data and he collects it very, very carefully. And you can see the tapes arranged. I believe they're in the cemetery here. And he runs the little machine back and forth. And the machines keep on getting improved. Every few years he gets a new one. It's better than the last. And he does, I'm not sure, I think he did half foot intervals. So every half foot, he runs this machine up and down that transect in two different directions. And the grid is very important for actually creating the maps so that I can go out later and look at through excavation the anomalies that he's identified. So, and I'm dealing with the earlier survey he did. At first, he just he did the radar on the part of the cemetery that they're considered developing. So some of my slides are a little outdated in that respect. So Tim came back with these results, and there's a lot of colors on here. They represent mostly the location of a radar anomaly and its depth below ground. And we call them anomalies. And it's a fun game between the radar guys and the archaeologists about whether they interpret their things in one way, and then we make sure and we do what's called ground truthing. So we go in and we excavate and figure out if it's really a burial, it's really a foundation, it's really a giant Peru Revolutionary War fort like he's found down in Maryland recently. Just looking at some of these anomalies, these colors that are on this slide, I'm gonna point to it with my fake laser pointer. Everybody see that okay? There's all these graves out here, but there's a couple other anomalies that he found. One of them is this pathway or trackway that seems to come in. There was also a large anomaly in front of the meeting house that that he actually originally interpreted as potential cellar hole, so a filled-in cellar of a building. And I just wanted to bring those two up because it's something we also looked at. Okay, and then sort of summarizing his results, the reds are the probable burials, the oranges are possible, and the yellows are tentative. He also identified possible foundations, the pathway, the filled cellar hole, and then several pipes and utilities, a septic tank, things like that. Okay, so one of the first things we did is we went out there and looked at this anomaly here. So this is what he thought might be a filled cellar hole, and we thought that was pretty interesting. It's something we needed to kind of to take care of. It's not quite related to the the parking lot, but the pathway, there would be some improvements, I think, planned in this location, another pathway going through. So we excavated it, and this is why we excavate. So his cellar hole was, we think it was a lens of gravel. And this is something I've talked with him once or twice about. And sometimes different soils, or if there's lenses of gravel with pockets of air, it can mess up his radar signals. It breaks them up. It makes them look stronger or lighter or deeper than they actually are. And that is why we ground truth. And that's not to say that I don't trust his results, but it's good to take these anomalies and test them, and just don't assume that everywhere he says there's something, there is. He's often he's also often right, but you do need to ground truth it. Okay, so we took his burials that he is probable, possible, and tentative burials, and we overlaid them on the project planned outline. So this light blue line is the proposed location of the parking lot and the pathway. And then we figured out 3 areas within that we could test that would sort of encircle the most probable burials, where we'd have the best chance of finding the burials and finding them and being able to investigate them. And we also tried to avoid things like existing standing gravestones and trees. There were some trees we had to avoid. That's why there's this sort of gap in between. So the idea was we would do these 3 trenches. We'd uncover and document the burial, the grave shafts, and then we would test and ground truth some of the grave shafts to see if there were remains in them. Part of our process is also use of a drone. This is up here. So we do a lot of mapping with a drone these days, and we create rectified plan views with the aerial drones, and we use them throughout the archaeology. So we do it before we dig, we do it while we're digging, and it really has helped us a lot. And this isn't a fancy drone. This is a DJI 3. It's you can buy it on Amazon. It's less than $1,000. And it's the one we've been using for, I don't know, 7-8 years now. We also go out there and we shoot all the stone locations in and the wall locations and trees in with a digital total station. This is some people might have called it a theodolite or laser transit. And this records everything's location relative to a datum with sub-centimeter accuracy. And we use the points on this to help rectify our drone aerial images. And you'll see some of those drone images as we go forward. Then we start digging. But before we started digging, and I don't have a good picture of this, we also did 4 or 5 tests by hand within the proposed trench locations to figure out the natural stratigraphy of the area, to see how deep the topsoil or A horizon was, and to see where the interface was with the underlying natural subsoils or B horizons, and to see what kind of interface they had, whether they had whether the A faded into the B, or whether there was going to be a very quick switch over from A to B that would indicate farming at some point. And then we use that information, those tests, to gauge how deeply we dug when we started the mechanical investigation. And I just want to point out that the man in the excavator is a guy named Steve Spalding, who has been working with us for, I think, almost 35 years. And he's the best of the bunch. He's a ringer. We bring him in for this kind of work. And he's actually had a steel plate welded across the teeth of that bucket to create a sort of super trowel for this work. And everything he does, we're right there watching him. And the idea was we would take the topsoil off, that darker topsoil, and then you would see the outlines of graves underneath as subrectangular stains in the subsoil. So that's where a grave was excavated. The soils were kind of mixed, topsoil and subsoil were mixed. And when after the body was put in, the soils were put back in, and they'll look different, and they'll be a different density, and they'll have different properties as far as holding water. And they just look and feel different from the surrounding subsoils. And that's how we identify the grave shafts. Okay, so this is the trowel line. So we've got that first 1.5 feet off, and we just get on our knees and start troweling down the trench, looking for everything we can. We look for artifacts, we look for color changes, we look for texture changes, and this is how we do archaeology. It's a lot of getting dirty. This is another shot. They've troweled down. In this trench, the grave shafts didn't show up quickly. That we had to go a little deeper, but you can see a grave shaft here, and then another one coming across here, and those were revealed as they carefully troweled over these soils and exposed the soils. And then this is where the a shot where the troweling's almost done. So they've got it cleared, and this is right before we do our photos and our drone photos and do some of our mapping. This is Mike Brown just carefully slicing off a little bit of soil at a time and exposing and delineating graves. And you can see this very square grave shaft right here, and a less obvious sort of ovoid grave shaft right here. And then he's got another one coming up here. I think there's another one over here. So he's just on his hands and knees troweling this off. And then when we get finished, we marked out all the corners with flags, and then we shoot that all in with the digital transit of the total station, and then we fly a drone over it. And then we draw it by hand, and we take the drone photos, the surveys, and the hand drawings, plan view drawings, and create plan views like this. So this is the extent of our Trench 1 excavation. These numbers in here, you can see this one says 21 is on the exterior and 22 is the interior. We excavate by what's called the context system, where every sort of action is given a number. So the action for 21 is the cutting, is actually the excavation of that grave shaft. 22 is the fill within that grave shaft. And so that's feature 21, 22 is what we would say. And then the grave shaft numbers here these are the grave shafts we ended up choosing to test because of various reasons. They look the best, they were evenly distributed across the property, that sort of thing. Again, and then these plan views were then put onto our drone work, and we rectified it all. One of the things that, especially in this trench, we have Tim's burial locations on here, and they don't really match up that well. I mean, some of them do, this one in grave shaft 6 certainly is close enough, but there's these two red ones, these two probable burials. This one over here, we didn't find grave shafts there. And there could be a couple of reasons. The soil colors might not have changed enough or been too different enough to be visible to our excavators. It's possible that they're very old graves and that the color, organic color, has leached out of them. It's possible there's a survey mistake somewhere between Tim and our data. You'll see on one of the next trenches, I don't think it's the survey data issue. Okay, here's another shot of trench 2. And again, these are various cuts and fills that we identified. I think going back here, we had something like 13 in here. I think we had 20 grave shafts in trench 2. And we selected, of those, we selected 3 to excavate. And here's the drone view of trench 2. And these really kind of line up pretty well. You can see that one, this one, all along here. They line up really well. So that kind of, that makes me think the surveying wasn't the issue. That maybe in trench 1 there's some soil condition issue that's preventing us from seeing the change in soil colors and delineating the grave shafts. Okay, and then this is the final trench. This is trench 3, and you can see the grave shafts here. In this wall. There's a couple more here. I think we found 10 in all in trench 3. And this is actually the one that got closest to a grave marker as well. It's just another shot of trench 3. Looking the other way. We did cross that pathway that we identified in radar at the very end, but we couldn't find anything that really told us what that anomaly was. I think it's probably compacted ground that, because the soil conditions at the time we were excavating, we couldn't identify during excavation. I mean, we have in the past at other sites been able to identify pathways and cartways and things like that. Just couldn't quite figure it out at this site. And this is the plan view of the site again. Grave shafts 1 and 3 were in here. This was grave shaft 10, but it ended up being a natural anomaly. It was roots and disturbed soil. It probably was some kind of rodent burrow, but it looked like a grave shaft to us, and it was the furthest to the south, kind of isolated from the other grave shaft. So we selected it as a grave that we wanted to look at just to see and confirm whether it was a grave. Okay, and then this is the aerial with the plan view overlapped. They roughly line up. They're not bad. He did have a grave shaft here, and that contributed to the reason that we looked at grave shaft number 10, even though it didn't turn out to be one. Okay, I like this slide because this is us printing out drone photos and taking them out into the field, and you can see these great rectangular stains and features, and we were able to take these photos into the field and figure out and select which grave shafts we wanted to investigate. And it just the use of drone has just been great for us. Usually we'd have to make someone stand on someone's shoulders who's standing in the bed of a pickup truck, who's standing on a bucket, and take some photos down. But now we can just fly this drone up and take some really nice shots pretty quickly and easily. Once we identified the grave shafts we wanted to investigate, we started the investigations. And this involved our archaeologists. That's Mike Brown, Taylor Napoleon, Lucy Bianchi, and Alexis Alemi excavating there. And you can see we have plywood that we put next to the excavation so you don't crush the walls of the excavation and knock them in. And then this orange tarp, this is one of our secret weapons. These are insulated tarps they use for keeping concrete warm while it cures. And we use these to cover the excavations at night so that they don't freeze. Digging up human remains and exposing them and then having them freeze overnight would be a horrible thing. And it did get cold at the site. This is how we arrived in the morning many times, where we'd have to pull the black plastic off and then pull the insulating tarps off, then pull the boards off the top of the burial shafts, the grave shafts, and restart our excavation. So we're fighting the weather a little bit. And then here's just another shot of us. These are, I think, the burial to the right has been excavated, and they're taking detailed notes. And these are the note sheets that we create at the end of the during the excavation. And then these are the sort of, once we enter it all in the database. And I just wanted to show these because of the detail you can see. Each bone is measured and in detail, and then there's a good description of the condition of the remains in there, age estimates, sex estimates, all the photographs we took of it, where they are. On the back, it talks about was there a coffin, what kind of coffin, what materials did we see, what are the widths and dimensions of the coffin, and things like that. And then finally, we did drawings, plan view drawings of all the remains, and that we identified. And so, and we have shown that a lot of these remains, when you pull them out of the ground, they're the consistency of, we say, wet cardboard. So you can excavate them and expose them, and you'll see them, and they look good. But when you pull them out of the ground, they quickly lose their sort of rigidness, or they become very friable when they dry out. So it's really important to do these measurements in the ground. Of course, not that we were removing any from this cemetery, but in other cases. And we've actually been able to use just measurements after things like femurs have broken apart to estimate height and things like that, from just the measurements we were able to take, because we take such detailed measurements while we're out there digging. This is what makes cemetery excavations expensive, unfortunately. All this data was then tabulated, and you can see some of this is, sorry to put a big table like this with a lot of text in a presentation, but I just wanted to show how we sort of tabulate it. Looking at grave shaft number 2, that was in trench 2. We also made sure we had tight vertical control. So the top of the grave shaft we identified at 2 feet, 2.1 feet below the ground surface. The top of the coffin, where we thought we found the coffin, was 3 feet below, actually below site datum. The top of the remains were 3.4. So it's not actually it's a pretty shallow grave. And this one was a 75 to 100% complete adult. And all these elements were still in place. And then there's some notes about the coffin. It was a hexagonal. And then there's notes about what kind of grave goods, shroud, fragments actually of the burial shroud and shroud pins. And so and all that information for each of the 9 burials that we excavated, number 10 being the one that turned out to be a natural feature. And this is just a continuation. There were really 3 good intact sets of remains. That's 2, 4, and 7. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about some of the remains. I'm going to show some slides, mostly drawings. I'm going to show some pictures. The pictures that I show that are of human remains they're not like very gory close-ups or of full skeletons, or they're just to kind of give you an idea of what we're dealing with. So grave shaft 1, you can see there's a hexagonal shaped coffin, and the coffin is there, but it's really only soil staining that we see. We see sort of the brown hexagonal shape in the dirt and it trowels away as soon as you trowel over it. This one was this one was probably for a subadult, we say, which we mean a child. But the very few remains, there was only some remains up by where the head would have been. So we weren't able to really say much more about this one. It did have, strangely, it had cut cut nails with T-heads, which are sort of more 1810, 1840. But it also had a couple of coffin screws, which are post 1851. So we're not quite sure what was going on with that. And we did, in most cases, check to see if there was a burial under each of these burials, because it's not uncommon for burials to be stacked in older 18th, 19th century graveyards. Okay, and then this is what we saw when we excavated, and you can see the dark sort of hexagonal outline, and that's the quality of the remains. These are nails and screws that you see here. Okay, grave shaft 2. This is one of the ones that had fairly good remains. There was clear wood staining from I think a hexagonal coffin that might have bowed out a little bit in the middle. This one had fragments of shroud and shroud pins still intact, very small fragments of shroud. And one of the other things we noticed about this one was that the jaw didn't seem to have any teeth in it. Teeth seem to survive more than a lot of other bones, but this one didn't have any teeth. And it also had a fused epiphysis, sort of the knee bone down there. The growth plate was fused to the bottom end of the femur, which happens sometimes with age, but might also be an indication of scurvy. But that's a little bit too unproven to really to talk much more about. So this was, we think, an older individual who'd seen some things. And this is a zoom close up showing the with that arrow pointing to a burial shroud pin and a fragment of the burial shroud still in place in the ground. And these are what the shroud pins look like. They're a copper alloy, a brass shroud pin that kind of held the shroud wrapped around the body. And we found these in a lot of the burials. It seemed like this was the way they did it. Grave shaft 3, we found the hexagonal coffin shape and coffin nails. We didn't see any human remains in grave shaft 3. So it was a burial, but it was potentially disinterred. The wood showed up very well, and we were actually, we found the bottom of the coffin at 5 feet below the ground surface, which is good for figuring out elevations things. But again, there didn't seem to be human remains in this grave. And this is a shot. Again, you can kind of see the hexagonal shape here. Maybe y'all think I'm crazy, but it's there. It really is. And there's some nails here too. Grave shaft 4. This one had a very incomplete coffin outline. We couldn't quite make the shape up. This was an adult. There was a small fragment of a burial shroud over here. Where's the burial shroud? I don't see it on the drawing. But we thought this one also had coffin screws. Coffin screws are they're sort of 1851, post 1851 to the 1890s. So this is probably a second half of the 19th century burial. This is 5. It's a rectangular coffin. It wasn't hexagonal, slightly different kind of coffin. We did find teeth with this one. There were some teeth near what was left of the skull, and then there's also shroud pins on the skull. And the teeth suggested that this was a subadult between the ages of 6 months and maybe a year. And one of the other things we noticed on this one was that the teeth were graying slightly, which might indicate the use of medical treatment that involved mercury. It makes the teeth gray. So unfortunately, this one probably didn't live very long and was sick. And this is actually what we saw of the remains. So it really just is the cranium part of it, and a very little outline of the coffin. Grave shaft 6, very fragmentary, decayed human remains, but there were iron nails and coffin screws suggesting a later 19th century date of burial. And this is sort of what we saw. The head might actually be off into the excavation there, a little bit higher up, that we didn't fully dig out. And then this is grave shaft 7. This is probably the best preserved set of human remains, and but the most poorly preserved coffin, which is interesting. Again, it's probably It's a post 1851 burial because we did find coffin screws, and it is probably a female. This is the only one we could actually determine the sex of because of some pelvis details. And these are some of the nails and screws that we recovered. The nails are along the top. Some of them were T-headed again, and some of them had sort of hammered circular heads, I think, and then the screws are along the bottom. It's all very corroded. They're hard to clean up, but we did retain a couple samples just to kind of look at them stylistically for dates. This is 8. This is roughly a hexagonal coffin. There's skull fragments and 3 molars, coffin nails and shroud pin fragments, but not much else. So there was a very obvious coffin bottom. You can see that dark stain along the bottom of the excavation there is the base of the coffin. And this is number 9, which is the last of the grave shafts we looked in that had human remains. Again, another hexagonal coffin that was obvious to us. Nails and shroud pins. And there was also nails down the center of this excavation, which they're not here because this is the final plan, but there were nails down the center of this that might suggest that this was a gabled or arched coffin top. Which would be unusual for this. We didn't find that anywhere else in the graves that we dug up, although our sample size is pretty small. Just like they're known for the 18th and 19th century, but they're not super common. And this is the state of the remains as we excavated them. All right. As I said, I showed you these tables before. These are sort of the summaries of what we found, and we put them into these tables. And let's see, the grave goods are identified over here. So the only grave goods we had were shroud pins and fragments of shroud. There was no coffin hardware like handles, decorated handles. There were no nameplates or anything like that. There were nails and screws, but there weren't things like coffin screws with fancy plates on top of them. Sometimes they'd have like a diamond-shaped washer that the screw would go into that would decorate the coffin. We didn't find anything like that. And one of the other things I think we noticed was that the 3 really good, well-preserved ones were all adults, and that the 6 poorly preserved were all subadults. And we think that probably had something to do with the preservation, the quality of the preservation. Coming down on the end here, summary results. The GPR, the ground penetrating radar survey, identified roughly 50 burials within the area of the proposed improvement. So the footprint of that parking lot and the paths and things. We looked for that cellar hole in front of the meeting house. It turned out to maybe be a drainage feature. We identified 13 grave shafts in trench 1 at about 30 feet below ground surface, 20 in trench 2 at about 2.5 feet below ground surface, and 10 in 3 starting at about 1 foot below ground surface. So there's something going on with the soil depths there, that there's more cover on top of the burials as you move back further into the cemetery. Of the 10 grave shafts we selected for excavation, 6 of them had less than 25% of the skeletons remaining, and 5 of these were judged to be subadults. We did check the soil acidity, and it was 6.5, which is acid, slightly acid, and this may have contributed to the poor preservation. So smaller remains in a slightly acid soil might not have had much of a chance, as opposed to more substantial adult remains. 3 of them, 2, 4, and 7, contained substantial remains that were adults, and we're only able to determine the sex of 1 of these sets of remains because the pelvis was in good condition. And then burial 10 was a natural feature, not a grave shaft. As I mentioned before, no grave goods other than shroud pins and fragments of burial shrouds were found. We didn't even find buttons. On other sites that we've excavated, you'd find, a button for a shirt or a button for trousers. But we didn't find any buttons out there, which really seems like they were very simply wrapped in shrouds and buried in simple coffins, as you'd expect. And then we did also, we looked a lot at the elevations and the depths of these things. And the tops of the burials with subadults averaged about 3 feet below the ground surface, while adults were 3.5. It might be because of the size of the coffin or something like that, but there was some sort of association. The subadults weren't buried as deeply as the adults. In other cases, we've seen subadults were present in a more shallow context because they were placed on top of an adult below. But that's not something we found here. That seemed to be in cemeteries where they knew where the adult was and they could bury the subadult on top. Maybe the method of not marking the burials might have prevented them from stacking bodies. But they didn't, and maybe, maybe they were buried when it was hard to dig 3 feet, maybe they were in the winter or something like that. So there was one very shallow grave, and that was grave shaft 9, which the top of the remains were at 1.9 feet below the ground surface. Unlike other cemeteries, I think there's a recent cemetery excavated 18th century in Philadelphia called the Arch Street Burial Ground, where they carried the bodies out in their coffins that they were buried in. The wood was in such good preservation quality, they could actually dig up the coffin and take the remains out in the coffin and then look at the remains in a lab. You saw pictures of the quality of the wood remains. At this site, there was no wood left. There's no wood fibers left. When you have intact coffins, there are often voids and things like that. And those are things that you need to consider when you're talking about building on top of the graves. You wouldn't want to go in there and have a bunch, go down and find a bunch of coffins where there are voids in them and then put parking on top of them. But in this case, we didn't find intact coffins or voids. And it's just something I wanted to point out that I think is probably important to the final recommendations. We think that the parking lot and paths could be designed to have little to no impact on the burials that we found out there. And just with some monitoring of the construction excavation and the preparation of human remains discovery protocol, you could pretty safely build the parking lot and pathways. And that's sort of our sort of final recommendation as far as the project's concerned. I'm on to acknowledgements. I just wanted to thank my team out there. Josh Butchko and Alexis Lemmy ran the show. Michael Brown helped a lot. Evan is the drone guy. Lucy and Taylor were real troopers for all the cold weather. And Steve Spalding is the master excavation operator. I also wanted to thank Nick and the Friends of the Meeting House Cemetery Association. Margaret Hickey provided a lot of material from Connolly and Hickey. Vincent Maresca was the archaeologist at the SHPA that reviewed my work plan, and I talked with him about it a couple of times. And I just wanted to thank Ray Chang at Morris County for helping fund this and also being part of the review.